Mrs. Miller, you set us up. I'm Christy Inman, Barbara's story as told by Clarissa Bowers. Early in my teaching career, I took a course on multicultural education in an effort to bring the world outside a little bit closer to our small town in Indiana. Most of my students had never left the confines of our county, let alone the borders of our country. So I felt like I had a responsibility to bring whatever cultural experience I could into my teaching. Like most teachers, I was dedicated to leaving my students a little better than I had found them. And looking back on it now, that is what kept me going through this experience. During that time in my life, I found myself teaching in one of the rural schools where diversity wasn't something that was regularly experienced. So, like many things that are unfamiliar to us, it wasn't regularly embraced either. Having just spent much of my time working to understand the importance of multicultural acceptance, I chose to do a reading with my 10th graders from the Hiroshima Diary, the journal of a Japanese physician, August 6th through September 30th, 1945, a book written by a doctor that spent his days tending to the victims of the atomic bombing in Japan. As I walked throughout the classroom, I implored my students to feel what these people were feeling and worked my hardest to paint a picture of what they were experiencing. At one point, I felt my own heart break a bit as I read the excerpt, and they had no faces. Their eyes, noses, and mouths had been burned away, and it looked like their ears had melted off. It was hard to tell the front from the back. I paused, expecting to hear the sharp inhale of my students match my own, and was instead rendered speechless as a quiet country kid slumped over in his chair blurted out, "So what? They're the enemy." Years have passed, and I still couldn't tell you what words I found to fill the silence that permeated the room, or how I finished my lesson. Where had I gone wrong in this? I was trying to reach out and teach about humanity and the struggles of other cultures around the world, and here I was, face to face with a student that felt nothing at the thought of these innocent people being maimed. Admittedly, a bit defeated, I spent the next few days trying to find a way to build some sort of cultural connection for my students, but mostly I just needed a connection for one. Simply reading to him hadn't done the trick. I needed to find something to forge a stronger connection. These kids didn't need another adult telling them how to think. Telling them how to think was likely how we got here in the first place. Instead, I chose to meet them on their level. If words weren't going to make them feel something, perhaps a movie could. Over the course of the next week, my students learned to live and love alongside Guido in the 1997 movie Life is Beautiful. The movie tells the story of a goofy Jewish shopkeeper that spends the first half hour finding ways to win over Dora by way of comedic yet romantic gestures and endearing moments. Like most romantic comedies, he eventually does just that, and they end up married with a beautiful son. Unfortunately, World War II breaks out and they are transferred to a concentration camp, where Guido uses his comedic ways as a method for a distraction for his son. Throughout the course of the film, you can't help but fall in love with Guido, as he turns each horrific aspect of the concentration camp into a fun game for his boy, each time putting his own safety at risk for the sake of a smile from his son. By the end of the week, the whole class had fallen in love with Guido and his son. They loved his sense of humor. They were glad he got the girl. They couldn't help but adore him for the risks he was willing to take to protect his son from the tragedy that was all around them. Every student was captivated by Guido's story and eager to see the story come to its happy ending. They were finally connecting to another culture despite it being unrelated to their own. In the concluding scene of the film, Guido tells his son to hide in a box until everyone is gone in hopes that a rescue team will find him. With a wink, he comedically steps around the corner with a guard. We see his son laughing while hiding in the box for this one last game. As Guido slips from view for the final time, the only sound that is heard is the wail of a machine gun. In that moment, you could have heard a pin drop. After a short while, the silence was broken by this same boy who was so lacking in compassion before. "Are you kidding me? They killed Guido?" I looked at him and simply said, "What do you care? He's the enemy, right?" In that moment, his face just fell. He had been just as engaged as everyone else, and he said, "Mrs. Miller, you set us up." It was such an incredible moment that even now, I get goosebumps. Here was a kid that, through no fault of his own, was taught that the Japanese were our enemy, and that was all there was to it. How do you consider anything else if that's all you've ever been told? Maybe it was by a grandparent or a great uncle that fought in World War II, but how could you ever know to consider an alternative if an alternative was never offered? I think about that experience often, and I realize how much it has sculpted who I am as an educator. Multicultural education isn't just teaching a story that comes from another country. The idea about providing and creating experiences for kids, authentic experiences that give them a chance to relate to people from other backgrounds, not just other countries, kids that they rival against in sports from across the county, or the kids that just moved in from out of state. Overall, it was really a watershed moment for me to think, who am I teaching? What am I teaching? I realized I'm not just teaching dangling modifiers and prepositions to these kids. That day, I was teaching kids how to think and how to be compassionate. And those aren't standards anywhere. Thank you.